So we have an interesting update on a story that we covered in a previous video, I think last week, in which conservative Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito took the bold and, I would argue, completely contradicted stance that Congress doesn't have the authority to regulate the Supreme Court. He was actually himself contradicted by one of his colleagues, the liberal/progressive Supreme Court Justice Elena Kagan. But before we unpack all that, if you haven't yet, please hit that like, subscribe, and the alert bell. Maybe check out my Patreon. I'd appreciate the support. So again, as a bit of a refresher, here's the situation we're in. Right now, the United States Supreme Court, the highest court in the United States, is dominated by a 6-3 conservative supermajority, regressively conservative. And right now, not just in terms of legitimate disagreements over Supreme Court rulings, but more importantly, investigative reporting turning out that in many cases, conservative justices like Clarence Thomas and Alito himself have been the beneficiaries, the recipients of lavish, luxurious gifts, undisclosed gifts from conservative billionaire benefactors, right? Which calls into question their objectivity, their judicial independence, right? If they're basically, some people would say the word bribe, but when they're being offered gifts that they're either hesitant to disclose, they're late to disclose, or they didn't disclose at all to the American public and the rest of the government, and in many cases, those conservative billionaires having business before the court or potential business before the court, it calls their integrity into question legitimately. And so as a result of this, particularly Democrats in the Senate have been saying, okay, listen, the Supreme Court, you all don't get to just do whatever you want whenever you want. People in the legislative branch, people in the executive branch have to comply with ethics laws. They have regulations over the sort of gifts they can receive, when, where, and how to disclose it. If there's that sort of oversight to prevent corruption in the legislative and executive branches, the same thing has to apply to the Supreme Court as well, especially when you consider it does apply to every other part of the federal judiciary, like circuit courts and district courts. They also have to comply with ethics rules because you just don't get a blank check. And yet Justice Alito seems to think he does. So as he mentioned to the Wall Street Journal in an interview like last week, he said, listen, Congress did not create the Supreme Court, Alito said in an interview with writers for the Wall Street Journal. I know this is a controversial view, but I'm willing to say it, Alito said. No provision in the Constitution gives them the authority to regulate the Supreme Court, period. So a couple of things there. What's he talking about? Well, Senate Democrats have said, listen, Supreme Court, if you don't want us to impose ethics legislation on you, make you behave ethically, then you all need to come up with your own binding code of conduct and present it to us and say, listen, guys, we're going to do better. Here's our code of conduct. We swear we're going to abide by it. It's no longer going to be a courtesy. It's no longer going to be discretionary. These are mandatory rules. And the Supreme Court basically gave them the finger, and they have refused to act, particularly the conservative justices on this. So in response, Senate Democrats have said, okay, well, if you're not going to do that, then we're going to pass, or we're going to try to pass ethics reforms, which will force, disclosure requirements. They'll beef up disclosure requirements. It's no longer discretionary. You will do this. There will be an enforcement mechanism. And also things like recusal. So if there is a party before the Supreme Court and you have a potential conflict of interest, like say in the case of Clarence Thomas, your wife shows up, or your wife is materially involved in a case before you, you will be forced to recuse yourself, or at least, if you choose not to, you will be forced to justify why you chose not to recuse to the American people. They'll have to see your rationale, because right now they're not required to. Common sense reforms. But again, Alito took the bold case of saying, listen, Congress didn't create the Supreme Court, and Congress doesn't have the authority to regulate the Supreme Court, even though in at least one section very explicitly of the Constitution in Article 3, I think it's Section 2 of Article 3, it does actually use the word regulation when it's talking about the Supreme Court's appellate jurisdiction. It's like, listen, the Supreme Court shall have supreme appellate jurisdiction with such exceptions and regulations as Congress shall pass, okay? So, number one, he's just wrong. And other constitutional scholars have been scratching their head. They're like, Alito, what the hell are you talking about? Of course Congress has the right to make some regulations on the Supreme Court, just as they do with the executive branch. Do you think you're above checks and balances? So all of which is to say there has been much controversy surrounding this, understandably so. Well, Justice Elena Kagan, who is one of Sam Alito's colleagues on the Supreme Court, I think she was appointed by President Obama, She was asked about this during an interview at the Judicial Conference, and this is what she has to say, and I don't know how long the clip will play, but I'm also going to play it at 1.25 speed. So Justice Kagan is here on my screen. It's the left, but let's take a look.
That Congress is currently debating whether to impose a code of ethics on the Supreme Court. And last week, one of your colleagues actually said that Congress cannot do that. And I'm curious, what do you think?
You can see it. She's like, why'd you have to ask me that?
Not giving me a pass in this interview. And, you know, I like the way, you know, it's a little bit stealthy. Start off with Andy Warhol. Okay, I did read that interview. I found it a little bit hard, honestly, because of the way the interview was written, to know what my colleague, I don't want to be like he who shall not be named, was Justice Alito, what question he was answering exactly, just because of the way the thing was written. I'm not quite sure what question he was answering exactly, so I think I'll just put him to the side, but I will try to answer the question, sort of. So, I mean, you know, can Congress regulate aspects of what the Supreme Court does? I think two opposite, or not opposite, but, you know, there are two poles here that seem pretty clear-cut to me. And the first is, of course, Congress can regulate various aspects of what the Supreme Court does. I mean, Congress funds the Supreme Court. Congress historically has made changes to the court's structure and composition. Congress historically has made changes to the court's appellate jurisdiction. And indeed, there's a provision in the Constitution that says something like, the Supreme Court shall have appellate jurisdiction under regulations that Congress provides, or as, you know, I'm missing the exact words, but it actually talks about Congress having a role in our jurisdiction. It talks about Congress regulating the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. And I think, you know, more generally, this is like not surprising. I mean, our whole system is one of checks and balances. And usually when the court talks about that, we're talking about other actors and the way they check and balance each other, or the way we check and balance them, but it just can't be that the court is like the only institution that somehow is not subject to any checks and balances from anybody else. I mean, we're not imperial, and we too are a part of a checking and balancing system in various ways.
All right, folks, so that was the single most important part of Justice Kagan's answer. This is the issue. Implicit to Justice Alito's argument is this idea that the Supreme Court, which again, 9 unelected, lifetime appointed jurists, are apparently above checks and balances. Checks and balances only apply to the more democratic, more political branches like the legislature and the executive branch. But apparently, Alito says not to him. The only checks and balances are only those that the Supreme Court deigns as a courtesy, as at their discretion to indulge. Hey, listen, if we want to disclose this stuff to you, we will, but we can't be made to. It's absurd. In many ways, the Supreme Court of the United States deserves more checks and balances because, and this is important, all branches deserve check and balances. They need it, right? Because they're all incredibly powerful in their own way. But the president serves for 4 years per term and has to be reelected and can only serve 2 terms max. He's constitutionally prohibited from a 3rd term. The legislature, you're talking about terms that last 6 years in the Senate, 2 years in the House of Representatives. These people have to constantly be elected and reelected and reelected. So there's a public accountability in the legislature and even with the executive branch, the president, in a way that the Supreme Court is not. Once they're on the Supreme Court, they're there for life or until they choose to retire. People say, well, they can impeach them. Impeachment is incredibly impossible. Think about it. You have to be convicted by a 2/3 majority in the Senate. It's an incredibly high threshold. This idea that Congress doesn't have the power to check and balance the Supreme Court in the way that they do the president is just, it's lunacy. And what's even more disturbing, I shouldn't say even more disturbing. What's equally disturbing in its own way, as Justice Alito basically offering that proposition, is the fact that it's celebrated by so many people. If you look at Twitter, if you look at conservatives defending the notion, they're almost gleeful at the idea of an unelected lifetime jurist who wields effectively unchecked power. That's insane, right? Conservatives, like, they spend so much time celebrating the wisdom of the founding fathers. And if there's any wisdom to be had, then surely we would agree the seminal wisdom is trying to remove ourselves from the yoke of an unelected lifetime tyrant, right? Which in that case was George III, King George III. Why would we then empower 9 miniature lifetime monarchs without any? It's insane. It's absolutely insane. It's completely antithetical to the vision of the founding fathers. And if that's something you hang your hat on, then you're forced to submit to this. The Supreme Court is absolutely subject to checks and powers and should be. And as a matter of fact, in some ways should be subject to even more because there's not the check of an election. So I think it's really important that Justice Kagan spoke out in this way. Now, again, she's part of a super minority in the Supreme Court. She doesn't have the power, even if she wanted to adopt a code of ethics. She and Justice Jackson and Justice Sotomayor, they don't have the power to make that happen. Chief Justice Roberts is probably the only one with some discretion to act independently as the chief administrative officer of the Supreme Court, but he doesn't seem to be in a hurry to do this either. This is incredibly important, and kudos to Justice Kagan, who, by the way, as a Supreme Court justice, I mean, she, in a very cynical way, you could make the argument, what she said was absolute principle, because she would benefit from lack of disclosure. Like, if you look at a lack of checks and balances as a plus, which a lot of people do, right, because that's the lack of restriction on your power, then from a cynical view, Justice Kagan should be saying the exact opposite of what she's saying. She should probably want, as much as anybody else, to not have any checks on her authority, right? That's good for her. But instead she's saying, no. There should be checks on my authority and the authority of the rest of the court, because that's how the system works. The Supreme Court is not above checks and balances. They are subject to checks and balances, just like the president and just like Congress. So that's great for Justice Kagan.